As we launch into the fall, we also are launching into a new teaching series starting this morning that's going to take us a couple of months as we journey through the Sermon on the Mount. The reality is, friends, that every single person in this world is building their life on something. Everyone is building their life on and around something or some things. Oftentimes, philosophically, we'll talk about things like worldview. That everyone has a worldview. Well, part of what a worldview is it's a foundation on which we build a life or existence. It's our conception, our thoughts, our beliefs about the world and how it works and how we fit into it. And really beneath a worldview would be some set of core truths. Right? I know increasingly in our world we don't like to think about universal truths, but at least for individuals, people have a sense of solid truth for themselves that they build their life on. These core beliefs, perhaps beliefs about who God is, if there is a God, what God is like, perhaps beliefs about yourself and your purpose and the reason for humanity or what the world is and how it works. And of course, connected to these realities of beliefs and worldview really is the creation of an identity. That is, who am I, or what am I trying to be? And in these questions, and certainly a whole ocean of other questions, we begin to build a life around the conclusions that we have drawn. We find what we believe to be firm foundation, or perhaps the firmest foundations that we can find, and we construct a life all around it. And I would suggest to you that we are always building, always tinkering with our existence. When Rachel and I and the boys first moved to Bethlehem about a decade ago, we bought this kind of older twin house that had kind of become dilapidated a little bit. And I can promise you that when we walked into it to tour it and think about it, the thought that both Rachel and I had was one good thought and a million bad thoughts, right? The million bad thoughts were nearly everything needs to be changed about this house. The one good thought was we can afford this house. And the house built on a solid foundation, and over the next number of years, literally from room to room and place to place, slowly but surely reconstructing and building it. And I think it's an apt metaphor or picture of our lives. Now, we might not sit down and overtly think this way, but every choice you make, every action you engage, the decisions that are around you, these are life constructions. We are building our existence in all of them. And we're never done, always tinkering, patching holes, adding new additions, reimagining sections, rearranging furniture. And life is filled with this. And what I want to suggest to you this morning is most of us, perhaps even all of us to a point, go through these processes with next to zero intentionality. That is, that we just do what we know, or we do what we've inherited, or we do what makes sense for everyone. But Jesus spoke directly into this reality in a pretty famous way. He used an analogy that even if this is your first time in a church, my guess is you have heard this analogy before. So, if you have a copy of the scriptures, you can turn to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, verses 24. This is what Matthew writes in recording the words of Jesus. He says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash." When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. The word of God for the people of God. The crowds perceived that Jesus spoke to them with a far greater insight and authority than any of the other professional teachers of the law that they had ever heard, quoted, or spoken directly. Why? Because his words spoke piercingly into the truth of their existence with utter clarity. They weren't just musings about what might be or what could be. They were poignant statements of truth. What is. Now, I cannot make you agree with the crowds who heard Jesus' words. And trying to make you agree with them would be an errand in the wilderness anyway. However, what I urge you to do today and over the next number of weeks is to listen and to honestly engage with your mind and your heart and to hear the teaching of Jesus and to make an assessment that is honest and thoughtful in the midst of the construction of your life. So Jesus says you can build a house on a rock or you can build a house in sand. And there are a couple of implications in this analogy that most of us are familiar with that I want to state at the beginning. And some of these you're going to say, gosh, this is so obvious. Why are you saying it? Well, one, because sometimes the things that are so obvious, we just kind of cast off to the side and then get into the weeds of the harder stuff. But the obvious stuff helps us understand the harder stuff, right? And so the first thing is that when Jesus uses the analogy of a house, in this context, he has a singular, or at least a greatest, purpose in mind for the house, right? And that would be to protect what is inside it, the possessions and the people, to be sturdy in the midst of a storm. Now, in our world, that is not always the purpose that we give to houses, is it? Many people do, but we use houses for other reasons. But in Jesus' analogy, or even parable, we could say in this moment, he's asking us to think about a house in that particular way. Second thing that's implied is that life is super hard sometimes. Right? You're onto it already, that this house is our life that we're constructing, and that because we're constructing a life in this broken world, while we wait for Jesus' return, that there's all kinds of storms. Right? And this word for rivers or whatever, it actually means like flash floods. Like, it's not just nice, peaceful, flowing rivers. Like, this is rain that is coming down so hard that it's overwhelming the ground and flooding things. But the imagery is almost of hurricane kind of force, with winds coming alongside of it. And of course, this is a perfect illustration in nearly every context of this world, isn't it? Though I think if Jesus was telling this parable or analogy just for us, he might change rain and winds to sinkholes, right? Isn't that a crazy common Lehigh Valley reality that when you moved here, all of a sudden you became acquainted with this thing called a sinkhole, right? Or if you've grown up here your whole life, you're like, what, sinkholes are a natural thing of life? I can tell you they aren't. I've lived other places around this world. There are people who have never heard the word sinkhole, right? So Jesus might say to us Lehigh Valley people, right? Be careful where you build your house, because at some point there could be a sinkhole. Sinkhole, rains, storms, winds, whatever you have it, Jesus is implying to his disciples, right? These are all people who are gathered around wanting to hear a religious rabbi teach. These aren't atheists or people who are far away. And he's saying to them, listen, life is going to be hard at points. Not always, but at points. And it's really, really important because sometimes people misrepresent the idea of, hey, if I build on the right foundation, things are going to go swimmingly for me. There's a whole segment of the church and of Christianity that wrongly applies the blessing of God, which means the presence of God, to prosperity. And it is wrong. Jesus says, hey, listen, even for people who build in the right way, on the right place, there's going to be winds and rains and storms. Or as he says to his disciples elsewhere, in this world you will have trouble. Right? I'm not saying that to just say, oh, shucks. No, we need to be honest about the pain and the struggle in our world. But I am saying that helps us understand the message that Jesus is saying. He's not saying, hey, build right and you're going to have aces. He's saying, build right and you will have my full presence that will sustain you in the midst of struggle. Very different things, but super, super important. The other thing that is implied here, and perhaps is the greatest piece of application, so you're getting it up front instead of at the end, right? Check mark off in my homiletic score this morning, is that building happens before storms come, right? Jesus doesn't say, hey, build your house wherever you want, and then when the rain comes, start getting ready for it. You know, with these pictures of people who live in Florida or whatever, and when the hurricane comes, right, they board up their whole house and whatever, and they kind of know how it goes after. And of course, that is all subsequent to the other things structurally they've done to prepare their places. But Jesus says to us, implied in this story, listen, if you're starting to build in the midst of the storm, it's going to be super hard. That is that you prepare for the storm in the midst of the sunshine. You sturdy the construction and you make sure it's built in the right place on the sunny days so that you can withstand the storms. And then after the storms, you rebuild. The idea of the house that's built on the sand is of a house that utterly collapses. It says that it crashes and that it crashes even more, almost in the original language. It's utter destruction. But the imagery of the house that stands is not of a house that moves through a storm, it is completely untouched. It's of a house that stands strong and sturdy. It might need some new siding or another window, right? Some things might have shaken around inside and damaged the walls. There's always reconstruction. There's always rebuilding. So in essence, Jesus is saying to you what I've already suggested to you. That is, hey, you're already always building your life. How about you do it intentionally and on the right foundation? So, assuming these truths and these implications, then we jump into this very basic and at some level very simple analogy that Jesus says. And so let's take the wise builder first, because Jesus orders it that way. He says the wise builder is the one who hears and does my words. He's like a wise man who built his house on the rock, and when the storms came, it stood the test. Now, Jesus doesn't come out and tell us what the rock is. We have to read into it a little bit to answer the question, what is this foundation that we're supposed to be building our house or our life on? But honestly, I don't think we have to read that far into it, because Jesus is suggesting that right construction, that is good building on the foundation, is putting his words into action. So if putting his words into action is building, then it would make all kinds of sense that the foundation is Jesus himself. It is that Jesus is the foundation, and what he tells us to do is the structure we build on top of it. And if you say, well, Adam, that's a little bit too much reading in, then I would point you to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where the Apostle Paul reads into it, I think, just the same way, talking to the Corinthians about how they ought to build their lives. He says, you build on the foundation, which is Jesus Christ himself. So Jesus then becomes the foundation on which we build our lives. But this can become a little bit abstract, right? Because Jesus is a person. In fact, Jesus is divine. And oh, by the way, Jesus has ascended into heaven as the right hand of God. How do you build a life on this abstract or esoteric idea? Well, you build a life on Jesus by perceiving a worldview through him. You build a life on Jesus by answering the core questions of belief and truth on him. You build a life on Jesus. You build on the foundation of Jesus by having your identity, who you are and who you're trying to be, founded in him. And this is why the gospel becomes so radically important. Because the gospel is, at some level, the Christian world view. When we say the gospel, it's really important that we pause and define it again. Because for many people, we have pieces of gospel and not totality of gospel. Right? So for many people, and this was my understanding of the gospel for a long, long time, and it's important and it's good. The gospel is that Jesus died for our sins, rose again, defeated those sins, and therefore, when I die, I get to go be with God someday. I want to, as I always do, 1,000% affirm that that is true and part of the gospel. But it is not the whole gospel. The whole gospel, as it is announced by Jesus himself in his ministry, would be something like this: that Jesus is the true and victorious King who alone has brought peace into this world through his incarnation, his coming, his death, his resurrection, and ultimately his ascension. It is a holistic and total thing. That is, that it is not just for you, it is for the world. Right? And it is not just for someday, it is for now as well. And it is not just about you being rescued, it's about you being called into a whole nother kingdom, a whole nother way of living life, a whole nother area of allegiance and obedience, which means rejecting allegiance and obedience to all the other things that we have given ourselves to. This is a holistic call. That's why Jesus is regularly asking people to count the cost. This is the worldview. for a Christian. This is the bedrock. Jesus, who he is and what he's done and what it means for us, is the foundation that we're called to build our lives around. Now listen to me, and I ask you to listen to me carefully, because I'm going to say things that could get me into trouble if you mishear what I'm saying. So I might say them twice or three times just to be very clear. There are some things that the church has elevated wrongly to foundation. And we need to be very careful because that can be incredibly dangerous. Now, when I tell you what some of these things are, they might make you sit back in your chair for a second, and that's why I'm asking you to listen to me. The first is the Bible. Right? The church has elevated the Bible too highly? No. The Bible is inspired. It is God's word to us. It is authoritative in all that it says. We have a high view of Scripture here. Don't mishear me. But Jesus didn't come to say, here is the Bible and build your life on it. He said, here is the gospel and build your life on it. The Bible tells us the gospel in an authoritative way. It instructs us how to build our life. It provides guideposts and guide rails, a blueprint at some level, but more, frankly, a narrative of what God has, is, and will do in this world that informs us how we ought to live. Here's the problem with the Bible, right? That people interpret it differently, especially in challenging places. And so if your foundation, if your life is built upon a particular interpretation of the Bible, there is a possibility that that interpretation is not going to work itself out to be finally true. Hear what I'm saying? And I watch people's faith crumble when their faith is built on secondary things and not on the ultimate thing. Likewise, Jesus did not come into the world and say, here is a systematic theology, build your life on it. And all of you are saying, what on earth is systematic theology? You're a nerd, stop talking about it. Well, systematic theology is a course, is a more than core. It's a large set of beliefs and a way of understanding Scripture in a particular way. They're super helpful. It's the really important stuff. It's thinking about things and relating it together in broad ways. But the problem is that systematic theologies are human creations. God never gave us a systematic theology. He gave us Jesus. Right? And so we have to be careful, because I watch it all of the time happen, where people have built their theology or their life around a theological bent or viewpoint or systematic theology, and then they find cracks or fissures in it, and ultimately the whole thing can come tumbling down. Listen, I'm talking in fairly nuanced ways here, but it's important for me, especially in this era of deconstruction, where people are realizing that they built their faith not on the gospel, but on other things, perhaps even really good things that are not ultimate. And of course, those things that I've just mentioned, the Bible and theology, are really important. Bible way more important than theology, of course. But then there's a whole host of other things, very much secondary. In fact, some of them wrongly informed, that the church has elevated in a culture of praxis that people are building their faith on, and it is sand, not rock. Right? It's the whole cultural reality that sometimes comes along with faith. That is that, yes, we're Christians, and yes, we follow Jesus, and this is what it looks like in our lives with I's dotted and T's crossed. Run, run, far, far away. Right? Or yes, we're Christians, and that means that we vote all together in one single block in this particular way. Red flashing lights. Danger, danger, Will Robinson. Right? Please, we say this all the time, please come to conclusions and convictions based on the gospel that you ought to behave in a certain way or vote in a certain way. Please do it, absolutely, 1,000%. But you cannot build your life on those conclusions. They will fail you. But Jesus does not. Jesus says, build your life on me and me alone. So if Jesus is the foundation, then what is good construction? Well, here Jesus is very clear that good construction is hearing what I say and putting it into action. It is necessarily both, right? That building on the foundation of Jesus and the gospel is hearing and doing. Just hearing is not good enough. Right? Just hearing would be like watching a YouTube video on how to fix a leak in your sink and then hoping that it fixes itself. Jesus says, hear and do. That we're called to actually internalize what he said, wrestle it through, find identity in it, and then live it out into reality. Fascinatingly, Jesus calls this builder wise. Now, there's a very common Greek word for wise, right? Sophia is wisdom in the Greek language. That's not this word. That word tends to be about things like learning or higher level of thought, deeper thinking, high levels of knowledge, etc. This word is far more practical. In fact, sometimes it's translated shrewd. In one place, it's translated crafty. Do you know who it was spoken of in that place? Genesis chapter 3. The devil. So what does this word mean? Could we translate it wise? Of course we could, because it's knowledge well applied. But Jesus, I think, in choosing this word, has a bigger understanding here, this idea of intentionality. This idea of exacting intentionality, of doing things with particular and specific purpose. One of the tools that we have tried to give to you, that I've tried to give to you as a church, and that community groups have in the past worked through and hopefully continually are talking about and discussing, is this thing called a rhythm of life. And I understand that that word can at some level be abstract or hard to enter into. But we choose that language because it's connected all the way back to decades and decades and centuries and even millennia of disciples of Jesus. They used words like rule of life, but I don't know about you, rule is a little bit too firm for my liking. So we change it to rhythm of life, and all it means is being intentional about putting the words of Jesus into action so that we order our lives on his foundation as opposed to something else. That is, that not just hearing, but how am I going to do it? Not just hearing and hoping, not even just hearing and affirming and believing it to be right, but then actually having a plan to begin to do it. Jesus says that's what a wise builder looks like. That's what it means to construct on the foundation. Contrastly, Jesus says there is a such thing as a foolish builder. And he builds on a foundation of sand. Of course, sand being incredibly malleable and shifting, and anything tethered to it is incredibly unstable, including every single person's beach umbrella over the summer, right? Jesus says a lot of people are building on that foundation. And in the midst of sunny weather, it looks A-okay, doesn't it? And then when the big swale of wind comes and the beach umbrella goes flying, we wonder what happened. Well, what is the foundation of sand? Again, Jesus does not overtly tell us. But I would like to believe that if the foundation of rock is Jesus himself, then at some level the foundation of sand is anything that's not Jesus. It is everything else. And you say, well, might some of it be like the wet, harder sand, and some of it just be the soft, dry? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. But all of it is not the ultimate. And how do we construct on this foundation? Well, at some level, we hear the words of Jesus and don't do them. That's actually construction on the wrong foundation. Or, though Jesus doesn't say it here, again, I think implied is, we listen to other words and we put them into action. We listen to the messages of other supposed gospels from other would-be kings or queens in this world, including ourselves, and we put them into action. And we do this, listen, at a radical level of subconscious perfection at sometimes, don't we? I mean, we are incredible builders, and we don't even know it. And Jesus says, as I would like to title this sermon, I won't, and you'll see why in a second, these people are foolish. Or as the Greek word says, moros, from which we get our English word moron, right? Title of Jesus' sermon, Don't Be a Moron. I say this because every once in a while when I get frustrated in traffic, I will call someone a moron, and Rachel gets really angry, and then I remind her, I'm just saying they're being foolish. Obviously, we don't want to demean people and call them morons. It's not a good thing to do. But at some level, do you see what Jesus is shaking us and saying? Don't be moronic. You see how foolish what you're doing is. And of course, he knows the answer. No, I don't. If I knew how foolish it was, I wouldn't do it. God created us to be sane people. The problem is we don't have eyes to see. We need new eyes. This is what the gospel provides us. This is what the teaching of Jesus provides us. A new way to see the world for what it actually is, not what we suppose it is. A new way to see ourselves for who we actually are, not what we hope to be. And a new way to see God for who he actually is, not some wrong characterization of him from the church or from the world. So how will you build? Over these next couple of months as we journey through the Sermon on the Mount, what we're actually doing is taking some time to assess the construction of our lives. Jesus starts this whole analogy with the word therefore. It is the conclusion to the Sermon on the Mount. And you say, if it's the conclusion, why do we start with it? Because it is therefore the lens through which we will read everything he says. To understand, it's always pointing to this. What are you building your life on? And how are you building your life? Sermon on the Mount, of course, is the great sermon of Jesus that many point to and say it is the ultimate ethic, only possible through the gospel and a life built on Jesus. So this morning, I ask you a couple of foundational questions, not so that you can answer them in this moment, but so that you begin to ask them of yourself day after day. Not to be morbidly introspective, that's not helpful, but to be intentional, therefore wise in our construction. First question: what season of life do you find yourself in? Is it sunshine and rainbows out there? Is it stormy? Are there storm clouds afoot? Is the storm still ongoing, but the most of it is past? Are you in a rebuilding stage? But at some level, post-COVID and all of the chaos in our world through political elections and racial strife, and I don't mean to belittle any of them. In fact, I'm making much of them because at some level, all of them chipped away at our structures. At some level, we're all rebuilding. Rebuilding can be an incredibly gracious blessing. Own it. Do it intentionally. It is possible in our where things are going well and in our faith, then get to work. Patching holes and re-insulating walls, and foundation means reattaching to the everything. Foundation and assessing. So question if you're built on. What foundation are you building on? Honestly. No one's getting graded on this. So we need to honestly think about it and consider. Third question. How are you and how could you be wisely or intentionally building on the foundation of Jesus? And fourth, are you building in isolation? Or are you building in community? There's so much I don't understand about the Amish culture, but my parents live in Lancaster, and those people can build things super fast. You know why? Because the whole community shows up to do it together. Would you give people in your community group permission to help you build? Would you give other people permission to speak into your life? Would you give of yourself to help those around you build? We have eyes to see things that in our own existence, we have eyes to see things for other people that in their own existence they cannot see. And vice versa is true. Over these next couple months, we'll talk about a wide range of topics. Wide range of topics. But all of them are less about that specific topic and more about the deep questions of how you build. And we will aim to talk about the specifics, but focus even more strongly on the bigger questions that are going to have wide-ranging application to our lives. You pray with me?